Hello, and thank you for joining me for the second webinar in the series of moving ETL loads to Azure. This is part one of it, and I'll just quickly tell you a little bit about myself. I've been using BuildMillScript now for about 4 years and used Bits Helper for just over 2 years out of those 4 years. I'm absolutely mad about Bumble, and I'm pretty proud of it. And I think as you go through this series, you'll realize why it's such a great tool set, why you should really get quite excited about it. I'm a contributor at bumblescript.com, so if you were to, in fact, you probably got this video from bumblescript.com, but if you just look through there, there's a lot of walkthroughs and sample script that you can look at. And I'm the co-founder of Virgins Australia. Just what have we covered so far? So in the previous webinar, and if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend that you watch that because this one follows on from that one. So in there, what I've gone through in a little bit more detail was configuring connections, databases, and schemas, and created a simple import of database objects just using the source metadata, using AdventureWorks in that case. And then I showed you two different ways of centralizing BumbleScript nuggets to create a little bit of the reusable components and patterns. Now the first one was an include file, and the second one was a call BumbleScript. And again, if you haven't watched the first series, go and watch that. It gives you just a quick overview of how you can centralize your Bumble code. So what is the moving data to the cloud or to Azure? There's a couple of challenges, and one of the main ones that we find when talking to customers is around internet throttling. They all wish that they had a bigger internet line or pipe for the data transfer, and a lack of bandwidth is definitely a big issue. I mean, everybody we talk to, we say, well, are you just going to use all of our bandwidth just to move data up and down? And what I'm going to show you today is, yes, we are going to move the data up and down, but we are on the, I suppose, the on-premise side of it. We are really saying we are going to limit that data transfer to the least amount of data that we possibly can. And then if you are going to Azure, I strongly recommend that you look into table storage, because it is a way to save quite a bit of money. But there is some design consideration that you have to take into context, and I'm not going to touch on that too much in this webinar. And then obviously you can federate your data. You need to decide whether you do your federation. So what we'll cover today, well, the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to go and do the blue component first, which is the metadata. So just going to follow up from yesterday, and I'm going to connect to the source system, in this case AdventureWorks LT 2012. And then from there, just using that natural metadata, I'm going to create the staging tables, sort of the objects itself inside of Mist. And using that metadata, we're going to create cache files, and the cache files are going to be one for today and one for tomorrow. So if you think about it, so I'm extracting the data, and I want to compare what I extracted yesterday, but you can't read and write to the same cache file, because I'm also going to want to write out what I'm extracting today and prepare that to be ready for tomorrow. And as I go through it, it'll become more apparent. I'm also creating raw files there. So I'll show you some of the code that does that. And again, all of the code that I'm going to show, although I'm demonstrating it in Mist, all of that code will work in Bits Helper. So if you are using Bits Helper, you can certainly use all of the code that I'm showing you right now. And then once I've got all my metadata sorted out, which I'll show you, and that's not a lot of Bimble code, I'll show you how that works. And then we're going to move on to the package. So now we're actually going to create the package that's going to extract the data from source system, using the cache file, do a lookup, identify the chains, and then export only the changes. Obviously, also export all of the data for the cache file for tomorrow, and then we're going to compress the data files. Just before I jump in, I just want to quickly go through the product overview again. Obviously, we use Mist as our IDE or integrated development environment. If you're using Bits Helper, that would be where that sits. And then you have really got to think about your Bimble and Bimble scripts into two distinct different sections. The one is the customer specific or project or package specific, even Bimble files and Bimble script, and that's when you have custom code that is only relevant to one object or to one piece of code, and that goes into the customer specific, and also obviously all of the sort of wireframing on that strings things together. And then you have the shared scripts, and I'll show you a couple of shared scripts today. These are scripts that you can actually centralize, and you don't have to ever create them again. It's one script that you can use from project to project to project, and those are shared scripts across your entire organization. And all of this is passed into the Bimble compiler. And the Bimble compiler will then spit out a couple of assets for you. Now, if you're using Mist, you can get the documentation and links tracking. So there's built-in documentation. When you then go into your database schema and TSQL objects, And then also, obviously we generate out the SIS packages, which again is a big component of the BIML, is people using it for ETL. And again, if you're using Mist, you can also build out your cubes and your analysis services. So with that, I'm just going to go straight into the demo. And here I've got Mist, and I'll open up the first file here, which is the environment. Now you've seen this before. This is just me setting up a source and target, and I'm pointing it to AW_source, which is basically just a clone of AdventureWorks LT 2012. Because I'm going to make a couple of changes in there as I go through these presentations, I just created a clone. I call it AW source, and I've got an AW extract, which is basically my landing area or my staging database. Define a database and define a schema. Yep, nothing really different there. I'll convert this to a live BIML script. So the first thing I want to do now is I want to go and extract my tables. Now, in the first presentation, I showed you how to create a connection, and then I also showed you how to say connection.import DB. Now I'm showing you a different way to do things here, just to give you a couple more options. It's always good to have options. So here I'm saying external data dot get data table. So this is going to actually against that connection, it's going to go and execute a select statement, and I'm just really selecting from information schema tables, where the base table and where the schema is equal to my source schema, and I'm ordering it by name and then putting it into a list. Okay, so now that I have in my table names to import, I have a list of strings, basically, of an array of strings, to be honest. And then I say, listen, for each table in table names imports, come in here, and then I do something a little bit different, which is connection.generate table node. And again, this is almost the same as import DB, but I'm actually just importing a single object. So and then I go and say, well, that's my source schema, that's my table, and here I have the same import options, which I can say exclude foreign keys, exclude column defaults, and exclude views, because I'm not really interested in those. And the next thing I want to do here is I'm going to now loop through, or I'm already in the loop, but now I have my table node in the same way as I had in the first example, and I can now go and set up my table, my columns. Here again, I'm using, I'm looping through my columns, and I'm saying for every column, go and transform column. And I'll show you that script right now, actually. And again, as you can see here, here is the include file that says go and include this function or this procedure. So I'll open that up, and again, you've probably seen a little bit of this, but long story short is I pass it in the table node and a table column base node. Now for this presentation, I'm really just going to say let's focus on this scd type.key. Now what that means is that for this table source system, I can say, listen, is that column used in the primary key, or is that column an identity column? And if it is, I'm going to set that column's scd type to key, and I'll show you a little bit more in a little while, the different types of scd types that you can set. And those are important to know, because the more you code BIML, the more you want to flag things for further use. And then I just have a very simple inspection of the data types of the column. And the key thing here to remember is for my XML data type, I really want to do something where I say, listen, cast that data type, cast my XML to an nvarchar max. Okay, and then I put that into an alt select. Okay, so I have an alternate select, and I can actually see here that I want to get my source data type, but because I'm already setting it here, I would actually get the wrong data type. So I'm just going to move that down and put that after this bit here. Okay, so now obviously what would have happened is I would have set my new data type to string and my max length to -1, which is max. But then obviously over here, I would have also said my source data type is actually string, which it isn't. I want to first say that it's XML. So I'll just delete that out and clear it up. And as you can see here, I've got a couple of things here down the bottom where I do the same to text and in text. And again, probably got this the wrong way around also, but I'll clean that up next time around. Okay, so save that down, and I'll go back to my tables to import. So basically what I'm going to have here is I'm going to now just go and also setting an annotation tag here. Now, I think in the first session I briefly touched on annotation tags, but I'll explain what this is. So on this table, I am now attaching an annotation of type tag and saying the tag is called source schema qualified name. Because in my package, when I extract the data, I want to select column list from the source schema qualified name, not the target schema qualified name. So I'm just saying, listen, at this point in time, I know what my source schema qualified name is. In other words, the schema dot table, and then I want to do the transform column. Now I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. You are more than welcome to look through the code when you have a time. Now normally I would do convert to live BIML script here, but I'm just going to execute the BIML script because I want to show you a couple of things there. The first thing is I'm going to go into this product model product description here and just show you. I'm going to reformat this quickly. There's a little great tool there where we can just reformat our BIML. As you can see, this table actually has multiple keys. And this is why I was saying that SED type. So I'm just going to go and delete that back, and I'll go control spacebar. You'll see here are the different SED types that you can set. So if you have a historical attribute that you say, well, hold on, this can't change, whether it's a key, it could be a surrogate key, it could be an update. So you have this option to, or it's audit column. You have these options here to set certain things against columns and then use that further on. And I'll actually show you why that's important, because we're going to be using that a little bit on. I'm going to open up the product model here. And again, what you'll see here is, let's format that again. Here I have catalog description, which is string -1, which is varchar max, or in varchar max in this case. I'm saying, well, the source data type is XML. So this is a great way that we can tag the source data type. Also, annotations can be exported into the documentation. Now, I discussed this with you very, very briefly, but we have this generate documentation button. And if you are adding annotations in the same way as you would add extended properties inside of SQL Server, these things are then built out into your documentation. Now, I'm not going to go into that in this session, but just to bear in mind that annotations have a real meaning inside of the BIML stuff. And the more you develop, the more you'll realize it, the more use you'll make of annotations. But what you'll see here also is I have a cast statement here into an annotation type called alt select. Again, I'll show you where that becomes in. So this is kind of like a great way to say, well, instead of selecting catalog description, I'm going to select cast catalog description as in varchar max and then as catalog. So with that being said, as I'll just save that down, I'm just going to go into actually the next code. And this is where I suppose the real power of BIML is going to start coming in when I start going through this code that I've got in front of me here. Now, the first thing I do is, and some of this code is a little bit more complex than it should be. And the reason why that is because I deliberately wanted to add one or two things into the script here to show you multiple ways of achieving things. So it's not necessarily you could achieve what I'm achieving here with maybe a little bit more simplistic code, but I'll actually put this in here to show you how I will use a dictionary and a struct. So there's the reason for that is that I want to give you, obviously the listener, as much different options in BIML script as possible. So when you do have a requirement where you want to use a dictionary, you can refer to this piece of code. Okay, so there is a real method behind the madness, so to speak. So I'll take you through the code here a little bit. So the first thing here, I'm just setting a root folder, but then obviously I'm defining a dictionary of table struct dictionary table. And I'll just go briefly and show you what that looks like. So here is just a public struct, and it's important that it's a public struct called table struct. And oops, that bounced on me a little bit, so I'll just put my cursor here. And then I'm just setting up my structure itself. And yeah, just refer to this. I'm not going to go into this too much detail. It's a little bit of C#, but this took me a little bit of time to figure out how to do this in BIML. I knew how to do it in C#, but just to hook it up correctly. And I thought, well, let me just share it with everybody here. So what I now do is I say, listen, hold on, for each table node in root node.tables, and as I just said, BIML is our root node. So if you wanted to visualize it, you can say, this is my root node, and these are my tables. So I'm saying root node for each table, which are these guys here, in root node.tables, bring that in. So now I have a loop of tables, and I just set a var, empty column here called cache column, and then I again have this. So the first thing I'm saying is, because I'm going to create my cache files here, I'm saying cache column plus equals, and I'll just have a little bit of this, and I am actually setting the index position equal to i.string. which means that I'm looping through this. So if I have multiple columns, I'll have multiple columns on my cache file. And after I've looped through it, I then get to this column here, because in my script, I'm going to actually, or in my package, I'm going to create a checksum of SHA1 checksum. Now I have a custom component that I use, which again I will provide as part of the code base. You'll get access to the custom component and the source code for that custom component, that if you want to use it. Now I've been using this for years, this component, and I've never had a problem with it, but please go and test it in your environment. If you're not allowed to use custom components in your environment for whatever reason, you can go to bimelscript.com, or actually in fact you would have been on bimelscript.com, and what you would see there is SHA1 script component using metadata here that I posted a couple of months ago now, and that basically is the same internal source code as my custom component, but it's just a way that you can actually do it inside of a script component rather than in a custom component. And if you are exclusively using SQL Server, or if you've got a version of a relational database that allows you to create a checksum or a hash byte, and if you want to look at the SQL Server one, if I just go metadata here, I posted a Metadata Starter Kit also on, I also posted a Metadata Starter Kit over here, and in one of these files, there is a include file that actually has the hash bytes in it. So feel free to download that code there. All of the code is there, and there'll be a hash byte in there somewhere that you can use. Okay, so let's get back here. So once I now have all of my columns in this cache column, I then create I basically go and insert this value into, I go and add it to the dictionary over here. Now, as I said, you could probably got away in this example with a list, but in some of my examples further on, I actually do have duplicate, not tables coming through, but duplicate lookups coming through, because a surrogate key, for argument's sake, could refer to, so you could have the customer shipping address, the customer billing address, the customer delivery address. You could have 3 addresses referencing a single dimension called address. Okay, so that's why sometimes you actually want to have a dictionary where you can say, well, actually I only want one address table or one address lookup that I'm going to use multiple times. Okay, now the next thing I want to do is I want to actually create the cache file. So again, it's good to see how little code I'm writing here, because that's what Bimel is all about, is about writing the least amount of code that you could possibly do. And to be honest, I could have probably created this once and looped through that twice also. Go and set for I equals, I loop through it twice and just have this in a loop that just appended on the second person, second run, appended this with current. So effectively what this has is I create a cache connector and a file connection for yesterday's load, and then I create a current, the same file but just with current over here, which is basically for today I am loading the data and I'm exporting it to tomorrow's file effectively, and when I show you the package it'll become apparent. The next thing we need to do is we need to have raw files for each one of these cache files, and again I'm just doing a for each loop where I do a key value pair against the distinct table. Now this bit over here, in my opinion, if you are doing SSIS in the traditional way, the drag and drop way, and this is your first view at Bimel, what I'm about to show you here, now if this doesn't rock your world, and you got to go and check your pulse, because in my opinion, every time I do this, I think to myself, wow, if I had to go do that manually, and one thing I really do not like doing in SSIS is configuring flat files or raw files or any of those things. Any file configuration that I have to do in SSIS, I just, it just pains me to do that. But I'm going to convert this to live Bimel script now, and I'm going to show you what happens. Boom. So all of a sudden I've done that, and what you'll see here is I've got 40, that's right, 40 connections added for me, and over here I have 20 kind of raw file formats added for me, or cache file formats added for me, and I'll just open one of them and you'll see here that there's my address and column. Now, if you got a 20, now I will put this for you in the context of the real world that we all live in. In the real world, which we have a project now with a customer, and we have over 300 source tables. The code that we use is no more than this code. We obviously have a little bit more things in there, but not a lot more. And imagine doing that, just setting that up for 300 files and creating a load and staging environment for 300 files. I can guarantee you that will take you a minimum a month to do. Okay. Now all of this code is yours, so it shouldn't take you a month to do from today onwards. Now let's get into the meat of it, right? This is why you guys are all here, to be honest, and which is basically all of this. Now, in the first session, I explained to you that the good thing to do, a good practice to do, is to create a wireframe or a scaffolding of your BIML file before you get stuck into coding it. Now, I've added a couple of things here, but don't worry about that. What I've done here is effectively just laid out almost like a Visio diagram. I have said, okay, hold on, what are the things that I need to do to create this? And I'll walk you through it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hold on, I've got to go create a source query, which is my select statement. And then I'm going to have to create a cache query. Now, the reason why I need to do that also is, imagine it's the very first time you run this job. The first time you run the job, because I want to look up yesterday's data in the cache file. Well, the first time you run this job, there is going to be no cache file, so the job's going to fail. So basically what I want to do is I want to say, here is my select statement. And if the file doesn't exist, if the cache file doesn't exist, the first thing I want to do is just go and create an empty cache file. So that on my first run, I can say, well, there's nothing in my cache file. So effectively, everything is a change. And that's what I do here. In this container section, I say, well, go and check if the cache file exists. And if it doesn't exist, I'm going to go and run a query that executes it. I've just left in the source query here, which was the next thing to do. And obviously, because I'm using the parallel constraint mode here, I have to actually define the precedence constraint first, okay? Because you've got two constraint modes. One is linear and one is parallel. Linear will basically say, string together all of my objects in the order that I'm defining them in the BIML file. If you say parallel, you actually have to tell the BIML compiler which packages or components are actually linked to what. So you have to manually link them up. So the next thing I do here is I say, well, I want to go, and after I've done my source, I want to go and do a checksum. So I've got a custom component there, so I'm going to insert that. The next thing I want to do is I want to go and say, well, I want to go and look up my cache file from yesterday. So I have a lookup, and then I want to derive my checksum that I've looked up. So the one that's returned for my lookup here, if it's empty or if it's null, I'm going to just set it to I don't want to use a null there. I just want to set it to a default value. The next thing, I've got a multicast, because obviously I want to cast it out. I've got two paths of it. The one is going to identify the change. That's the first path. And only the changes will go into a raw file. And on the second path in the multicast, it will go straight to tomorrow's cache file. Okay. And lastly, but not least, I'm going to have a process the file. And I'm going to go, right, I'm going to script the process the file, which is basically going to just prepare the files for tomorrow, and then compress or zip up the raw file that I want to send up to the cloud. Or even, I say I'm going to send it up to the cloud here because that's what we do in our environment, but you can use the same pattern for two on-premise servers, or even for this, if you're only on the same server. So think about it, there's two distinct processes. The first one just gets me all the changes. Now this is a good way if you don't have CDC in place, or you don't have access to that, or even if you do have CDC in place, you can still use this process to sort of just create the zip file stuff. So you can mix and match a little bit here, and that's a great thing about BIML. So once I've done it, I was going to strip all the files up. So I'm going to go in here and now start adding some code. Okay, so the first thing I will do is I want to have to prepare the source query here. So I'm going to just insert the code. Now I'll show you, go talk through this loop very quickly. So again, I've got for each table node in root node.tables, and I've explained to you what that is. And I've got two queries here. The one is a source query and a cache query. And then I've also created this sort of array of strings here, which is ignore columns. And again, this is just sample code that I'm adding for your benefit. I don't actually have that in my example, but it's a sample code that I use in other projects that I thought I'll just add it to you. And then I'm going to loop through every column in the table. I'm looping through that, and I'm saying, and again here, I'm giving you a little bit of link query here. And again, it's not relevant to this project, but again, I'm just as an example showing you how you can, if you had an annotation on that column saying it should be processed and to be processed equal the text isn't false. So that's saying basically I have a process that says these columns I want to process, these columns I don't want to process. So it gives you the option to sort of selectively exclude columns from your ETL process. So it's just a way, again, to show you. So then I say, well, if the column that I have here is not one of those, then actually add my source query, and then I inspect and saying, if the annotation alt select is not equal null, in other words, I have to find an alternative select statement that which is that cast XML that I showed you. It will use that alternative select. Otherwise, it'll just join this column together. And the next thing I want to do for my cache query, because so that's my source query. Now my cache query, I don't want all the columns. In fact, if for my cache query, I just want all the key columns. Okay, and then I just sort of initialize the cache query and the source query, and in the cache query, I add the row checksum, which is just a empty binary file, binary 20, and I do a sort of where 1 equals 2 at the back there, just to get an empty file. Okay, so I then come in here, and the first thing I want to now do is I have this container here, where I want to go and check if the file exists, and if the file doesn't exist, I'm going to go and create it. And then which is this bit over here. So the first bit here is just a script task here, which basically just is going to go and check if the file exists, and if the file doesn't exist, it's going to go set a boolean. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to have a data flow here, and in that data flow I have a precedence constraint here, which basically says, well, that guy has that script component there should have executed successfully. And then also I'm checking an expression here of a file exists equal to true. So the next thing we need to do is go down here where the source queries, and as you can see, you've got a custom component here, and I'm just going to paste in the code for that. So I'm not going to go through too much about this custom component itself. The only thing that I want to show you here is that on the input path and the input columns, I actually want to loop through again through the table node and through every column in there, and here is where I'm inspecting the SCD type of key, and if it is SCD type of key, I'm just adding it to it and saying, well, go and if it's not a SCD type of key, go and add it to the to the checksum, and basically create a checksum. So if I've got a table with 30 or 40 columns, actually I'm just creating a checksum for that is one column that represents the 30 columns. So that makes it a lot easier for me to compare it further down the track. So the next thing I want to do is, when I obviously say, well, now that I have that checksum, I just want to go and create a lookup. So again, simple lookup. I'm doing a cache connection lookup over here, and I'm coming in again, just showing you again a little bit of a different way of achieving the same thing. So over here, I've looped through the columns, and then I have an if statement here. Here I'm actually adding that into the link query with a where clause. So again, that is specifically added into the script to show you two different ways of achieving the same thing. Okay, and what I'm saying here is, well, if it is the key, it's an input column, and then the output column is the checksum. So basically, if I have a table with 3 key columns, I'll have the 3 key columns here as source and target, and I'll have a single row checksum that I'm outputting as a lookup row checksum, because obviously over here I have that row checksum already in my pipeline. Over here I've got my output column as row checksum, and because I want both of these checksums in my buffer, I now give it a different name over here. Okay, and then lastly I'm going to insert obviously the derived column here that's going to do my just derive the default. So again, I've got my lookup row checksum here, and I'm just setting it to sort of like the DT bytes 20 of 0, and that's what I'll use for my comparison. Now I have done my lookup, and now I want to just go and multicast it into 2 different things. Now, you know, this is not rocket science, you can easily figure it out. So I've got 2 output paths, one called extract and one called extract cache. The extract cache path would obviously go to the cache component for tomorrow, and I'll do a conditional split here. And all I'm doing in the conditional split, I'm basically looking if the lookup row checksum is null, or because I've set it in the derived column to a default, I'm saying, well, if it's that default, I know because that column is effectively null, it's a new row, so I need to use that as an insert. Or if my row checksum is different to the one that I created yesterday, obviously that also constitutes a change, and I'm just putting it out to output path called change. Okay, and then simply the output path of change goes to a raw file and the input path is obviously the change one, and I'm outputting it to a variable name here called user output file, which is basically defined right at the top here as output file. There's my file name, which is the cache that I'm using for my and these things are hard set at the moment. You can easily parameterize that. I'm not going to do that in this webinar. I'm definitely going to show you that in probably the next one or even the one thereafter. And then file exist is that boolean that was coming out of this first script task there. Now that I have casted to my raw file only the changes, I obviously want to prepare my cache file for tomorrow. And it's, as I said, it's very one thing you'll see through the solution is that you don't really need a lot of BIML code to achieve a lot of output. And last but not least, I'm going to go and insert the script task that does the process file, which basically just goes and sets everything up for tomorrow and then zips it all up. Now, before I execute everything here, I'm going to show you what these files look like and just show you that it's no rocket science here. That pretty much the file exists one is just those 3 lines of code. It basically says, well, grab that file, check if the file exists. If it does exist, it's true, else false, and then putting that back into the variable. Very, very simple code there. And the process file, very similar. You know, sorry, there we go. It has a sort of function down the bottom here that basically zips it all up. Now, this pretty much was grabbed straight out of one of the Google searches. It's not a big deal there. Now, obviously, with using the I/O compression, there is some limitations in how big the size is. Now, if that is something for you, by all means, you know, there's other methods of achieving compression, etc. So you would probably need to find out what works in your environment. For us, this is pretty simple, you know, because we're only picking up changes. And when we did our initial load and we grabbed all of the data, we did go through well, this is not going to go through the normal process of this is not our incremental load. And we did a couple of manual steps to get our first cut of data across. Then all this does is basically says, well, you know, take today's file, rename it to yesterday's file, delete the old file, and then if the file exists, move it, and just a little bit of error handling there. And the last thing here is then we're going to compress the file, and that's it. So we're getting the cache files ready for tomorrow, and then we're just zipping up the raw file. Okay, so I'm going to convert this to a live BIM script. You see I'm using not the one that I was busy coding up, I'm just using the other one here, which is exactly the same code. I'll open it up just so you can see, but I sometimes forget the odd space here or something in there. It's exactly the same code. There is nothing more or less to it. Okay, and I'm just going to convert this to live BIM script. And again, you know, imagine 300 tables, right? And all of a sudden I have my 10 packages there, all exactly standard, all doing exactly the same thing. And if I wanted to go change my pattern, I go into the backend file here and go and change the pattern once, and it is applied to all 100 or 300 packages, however many packages there has. Now, on this project we use a MySQL source system. So what I'll do in the near future, so I could have already done it depending on when you're watching this webinar, I'll be posting up the similar code, a sample code of how you do it for MySQL, and pretty much the only thing that will be different is this get transform column here. Okay, long story short, I'll then hit build on this. So I'm now just going to build out the project, and I'm now they're also going to go and open up. So while that's building, I'll just get Visual Studio open just to show you the output of that. Okay, and also I'm going to go in here and show you my temp drive, and I'm just going to delete this out because this was my test that I did. The build, as you can see, has completed successfully. And in Visual Studio, I'm just going to go and say File. I'll probably have it down here. No, open. Sorry, File, Open, Project Solution, and there it is. And there's my project. Okay, so I'll open this up and I'll show you what that does. Okay, so here we go. I'm just going to open up the customer here, and these will all be the same. Now, I could have also had a control package and put all of this in a project parameter thing. I'm not doing it today. I'll show that to you. And as I say, there's my sequence container, file exists, table, that loads to a cache file, as you can see here. Simple query that has that sort of where 1 equals 2, creates an empty cache file, will load my data, my package. As you see, source, checksum component, which I'll provide you all the code for. Lookup, derive some defaults, multicasted. My changes come down here into my raw file, and my cache file for tomorrow is prepared over here. Okay, and here is the script process task, which I'm not going to open up. I've already shown you that code. So I'm just going to run them. They'll all look the same. So I'm just going to run one of them. Sorry, execute package. Where is that? The button there. I'll have to execute the package there. And obviously this is adventure work, so this is going to be super fast. Just to execute this little package here. And then what you'll see here while that is executing, you'll see here comes in my temp file. Well, temp directive, bang, there it is. You know, the customer raw file is zipped up. There's my cache file for tomorrow, and there's the raw file, which I could also go delete if I choose to do. Now, I'll go into here quickly and just show you that I'm now going to just update. So I'm going to update about 440 rows there. So if I were to execute this package again, I should get 440 rows coming through my change pipeline. So I should get, I don't know how many it was, 800 something coming here, and I'll have 440 going through there. Okay, so I'll execute the package again. And let's just have a look at that. Yep, 440 rows changed, 847 into my cache file. And if I go back to my zip file here, you'll see here it's much smaller. So that's a way that you can control change on the, I suppose, the on-premise server, that you don't have to go and take all the data up to your second server. You only take your changes to your second server and you work it from there. Okay, so that is pretty much it. I'm just going to very quickly show you some of the resources. So again, that's my Twitter handle there at BimmelDownUnder. Please follow me if you want. BimmelScript is obviously the Twitter handle for BimmelScript. We've got 2 LinkedIn groups there. We've got the LinkedIn group for Bimmel user group, and if you're in Australia or New Zealand, we've got the Bimmel user group for Australia, New Zealand. Basically, there is a link there. We post quite a couple of things on there. You know, we're doing a couple of Bimmel specific user groups coming up. One in Sydney, one in Melbourne, one in Brisbane, and there will be one in almost every city that we do. We're just going to work out some of the details. Any information about Mist, Verigens.com Mist, BimmelScript.com, please go there. I mean, you've obviously been there already, but that's where you would find loads of resources around BimmelScript and Mist. Bits Helper, if you want to download Bits Helper and use Bimmel that way, which is obviously a great tool. Even if you don't use Bimmel, that's a great tool set there if you're a BI person. And all of our documentation on Verigens.com Bimmel. Now, I just want to point out that I'll make all of this code available, and please feel free to use any or all of this code if you want to present it at your local user group or at the SQL Saturday. Also feel free to reach out to me if you want to get a little bit more information around this framework or the things we do here. I know I've already received 1 or 2 emails of people asking me for a little bit of advice. I really do not mind. Obviously within bounds, I'm not going to write your project for you, but if you are struggling with some specific Bimmel script component, or you're having a little bit of trouble, please feel free to reach out to us or post something on BimmelScript.com. And there's also on our Verigens website, there's forums, there's Bimmel forums, and there's Mist forums. Feel free to ask the question and we'll get back to you. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.